Good morning, everyone. Welcome to SciFiDevCon. My name is Allon Mureinik, and the title of my talk is We Are the Borg, You Will Be Interviewed. Before we get started, let's just get this out of the way. The mandatory reference is, of course, the Borg from the Star Trek universe. But now that I've gotten this out of the way, let me properly introduce myself. So, as I said, my name is Allon Mureinik. I have been part of the software industry since 2001, both as an engineer, a senior engineer, and an engineering manager. And I currently work at Synopsys, where I manage R&D for the Seeker agents. Seeker, if you haven't heard about it, or rather haven't heard about it yet, is probably the best interactive application security testing, or IAST, tool out there today. But as fascinating as security is in general, and IAST is in particular, it's just not my topic today. So this is the last time I'm going to mention it. Since about 2004, I've been involved in some way, shape, or form in the interviewing process. I've interviewed for the different companies I worked at. I wrote interview questions, I reviewed interview questions, I reviewed interview processes or recruitment processes. I've helped sources. I've been involved pretty much in every aspect of this process besides being a recruiter myself. Since 2018, I've been taking these skills and putting them to some good use by volunteering for Ba'ot. Ba'ot is a local nonprofit organization dedicated to improve the diversity in the software industry. They do this by helping women break into the industry. They do this by helping women plan and advance their career so they don't drop out of the industry. They do a world of great work. Feel free to check out the link. I'm only involved in a really small part of it. As I said, my corner there is interviewing. I and other volunteers, we conduct mock interviews for software engineers, for engineering managers, for quality assurance engineers, and we help them prepare for their real interviews. And lastly, just so there won't be any misunderstandings, despite the "we" in the title, I myself am not a Borg. If you don't believe me, just ask my wife. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about interviews. I'm going to share some horror stories from a really bad interview process I had back in the day as an interviewee. I'm going to share some of my experience, some of my ideas on how to make this process a bit less horrible, both for interviewers and for interviewees. And as I've already started, I'm going to make a bunch of bad Star Trek puns. Now, if this alarms any of you, let me reassure you, I'm not really a Trekkie. None of these puns are supposed to be too obscure. And I don't think anyone who has heard of Star Trek and watched a couple of episodes will miss anything here. But if this still alarms you, let me further reassure you, even if you don't get the references, you won't miss anything. I'm not really funny, and none of these jokes are either. And again, if you don't believe me, ask my wife. So let's get started. Let's talk about interviews. Interviews are often a weird situation, a stressful situation. Obviously for the interviewee, because they're sitting there in front of someone with a very one-sided power dynamic. And after an hour, 2 hours of talking and whiteboarding, I don't know what, this little chat will determine the rest of their career, or will at least affect the rest of their career. For the interviewer, this is also quite stressful often. First of all, because it's odd. It's outside of our normal day jobs. Most of us are engineers or engineering managers or data scientists or quality assurance engineers or whatever you do for your company. Most of us don't interview every day, all day. So this is kind of something weird and new. A lot of us aren't really prepared for this, aren't really trained for this. Good companies do offer training and support for the engineers that interview for them. A lot of companies don't. A lot of good companies don't, and most bad companies don't. And also, for a lot of us, we too feel this one-sided power dynamic. And for a lot of us, we feel uncomfortable. Who am I to decide if this person is quote unquote good enough to join our company? So what a lot of us do to alleviate the stress is trying to learn about it, trying to look outside, trying to consult and see what others are doing. Now, generally, this is great. Learning, being prepared will make you a better interviewer. The flip side of this, especially in tight-knit communities and small communities, small tech communities, where everyone knows everyone else, is that we talk and we share information, and quite often we get fashions to these interviews. Once someone's started doing something, everyone else kind of picks up on it, and before long, a lot of these interviews become very similar. So everyone copies or is inspired, to be more politely, by everyone else. The story I want to share is about a series of interview processes I was going through in 2006. So back in the day, the flavor of the week, the fashion, was design patterns. Apparently, anyone read the exact same book. So design patterns are these common practices or best practices sometimes to solve common problems. These aren't usually something technologically new, but kind of thought patterns. How can I take the building blocks of whatever programming language or environment I'm working in and use them for some predetermined recipes to solve common problems? So back in the day when I was interviewing, all of these interviews looked exactly the same. Do you know any design patterns? Yes, I do. So give me a couple of examples. It's always these two. Yes, I know about the chain of responsibility and I know about the singleton. Okay, great. Let's talk about the singleton. So singleton is a design pattern where you need to have a single instance of an object. It has to be accessible to the entire system, and it absolutely must be a single instance. You may have zero if you don't need it, but you absolutely positively can never have two of them. It needs to be exactly one. Now, this design pattern comes to solve a series of problems where you need a single source of truth, like a configuration object. You definitely can't have two competing configurations where one part of the system thinks that today is Tuesday and the other one thinks it's Monday. A logger is a good example of a singleton. So you have maybe different logging categories, they have different formatters and different logging levels, but the logger itself has to be single point of truth, single instance that allows you to configure these loggers, that's in charge of opening files, closing files, rotating files, anything like that. And you positively can't have two of them, because if two instances are competing on the rotating files, you may lose your logs. So what was the common thing I saw in all of these interviews? I would say I know what a singleton is. They'd ask me to explain, which I just did. And then we'd get an exercise. Let's build a singleton together. A common example of a singleton is a clock, or in Star Trek terminology, a chronometer. Now, you may ask, well, every programming language that I know has some interface to get the current time, the system clock. It may not follow this design pattern, but it is a singleton. Wherever I access the system time, I get the same time. Why do I need to design anything? So the answer would always be, okay, let's add some logic to this. Logic. We don't just want the system time, we want to freeze the time sometimes. For testing purposes, we want to be able to set a specific time and then see how the entire system behaves. So for example, we want to set the date to Zephram Cochrane Day, and every screen in the system needs to display an interesting factoid about warp technology. So here's our logic. Well, great. Here's a logic problem. Let's start by implementing it. So back in the day, I was interviewing in Java. In 2006, Java 5 was pretty new. I don't exactly recall when it was released, but it was relatively new, and definitely in the local industry, they were just starting to warm up to it. So logic. I have system call time millis, which is the system clock. I'll add my own data member for my set or frozen time. We could use a wrapper. We could use the Java lang long object, but it's kind of wasteful to have an entire object where all I need is just the time, just the primitive long. So we'll take a primitive long, initialize it in something invalid like -1, which is an invalid date in Java because we always count from the epoch forwards. I'll have methods to set and unset it, and then when someone queries the time, if it's set, we'll return our member. If it's not, we'll just return the system clock, system.callTime millis. Great, lots of logic. Now, onto the meat, onto the main part of the interview. Let's make this a singleton. So, how do we implement a singleton in Java? We have a single static instance to hold our, well, this is tautology, but to hold our instance. We make the constructor private, so no one can instantiate a second instance by mistake. And we have a get instance method to return this single or singleton instance. We do this by an idiom called double checking. We check if the instance is null to see if no one initialized it yet. If it is null, it means we might need to initialize it. We take a lock, we synchronize on the class object, because maybe some other thread initialized it in the meanwhile. We check again if it's null. If it is null, we know it absolutely has to be null because it's under this lock. So now we know we can safely instantiate it. And now that we're sure that we have an instance, we just return it. Now, this was a very common idiom in Java for a long time, way before Java 5. and it was, to put it blatantly, just wrong. Before Java 5, you could not ensure that the JVM wouldn't reorder instructions around this. So this may look cool, but it didn't really work. In Java 5, we finally got the volatile keyword that really allowed us to ensure that things won't be reordered here. So this is an implementation of a singleton. Or if you want to be a smarty pants, you ask yourself, why do I need all of this? So this idiom is kind of designed so you don't instantiate the singleton before you really need it. Maybe the initialization of the singleton instance is really heavy because it needs to read from a configuration file or database. Maybe you don't just want it to arbitrarily be initialized because there's some order. You need to initialize the database connection first and then the singleton that relies on it, for example. And probably you you may have a situation where not every flow in the system needs the singleton. So especially if it's very costly to initialize it, I may not want to initialize it just out of the box, but only on demand on the first time I call get instance. This is not always true. Specifically in this example, it's very untrue. The initialization is super cheap. We just call new on an object that has a single long data member. And it's not dependent on anything else. And it's very unlikely that there's any flow of the system that won't need access to the time. So all of that reasoning just goes out of the airlock, and we can do something much simpler, rely on the class loader to have a single thread that loads this class, have a static member which we immediately initialize, and have a get instance method which just returns this instance. The constructor, as always, remains private, so no one else can initialize any other members. So the first time I had such an interview, it was intriguing. It was an interesting technical problem for someone who didn't do too many of these before. After another 2 or 3 of these interviews, which all sounded very much the same, it became intriguing on a different level. It became intriguing on a human level. I started to question myself, why am I implementing so many singletons? Have I been missing anything about the industry? Is the difference between being a software engineer that I was and a senior software engineer that I wanted to be, the ability to implement a singleton? Have I been going at things wrong? Have I been mismanaging my career? And around the 4th or 5th interview, this stopped being intriguing and started being laughable. And I'm being polite here. It started to be, quite frankly, just stupid. It started becoming ridiculous. Not only ridiculous, it very quickly became repetitive. I started asking myself, how come that I'm interviewing for different companies in different problem domains? Okay. Back in the day, I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted to take my career. I knew I wanted to be a software engineer, but I was interviewing for companies that did monitoring, or what we call nowadays, we'd probably call it observability. I was interviewing for companies in the ad tech space. I was interviewing for companies in the cybersecurity space, which I wound up in 15 years later. I was interviewing all over the show, and somehow I was being asked the same sort of question wherever I was going. I was starting to think, what's wrong with all of these interviewers? It's fine if people talk and share information, people have friends, people have support organizations, but I'm getting asked the same question everywhere. Do all of these interviewers have some collective consciousness, some hive mind? Are they Borg? And after too many of these interviews, I said to myself, okay, I see how this is going. I understand I'm being interviewed by Borg drones, unfortunately. Great. Well, in that case, two can play this game. And if my interviewers can be Borgs, maybe I also should be a Borg. So when an interviewer came up and asked, what design patterns do you know? I would say, well, I heard about chain of responsibility and I heard about the Borg design pattern. So if a singleton is an object where you have exactly always one single instance which allows you to share a state to anywhere in the system because any part of the system can access this object, a Borg design pattern allows you to have multiple instances, as many of them as you want. You can instantiate them at will wherever you want, and they all have the exact same state. This is the Java example. We just have a single, for this case, a single static, this is the point, static data member. And well, the constructor is implicit. You can instantiate however many Borg drones of these you want, but wherever you instantiate it, whenever you instantiate it, however you pass it around, if you query it and ask for the time, they'll all give the exact same answer. They all have the exact same state. Is this a singleton? It is not. Does it solve the exact same problem that a singleton does? Most definitely. Is it perhaps a bit easier to use because, well, we all know how to use the new operator. We don't need to think about double locking or stuff like that. And it's much easier to integrate in other technologies that we have, like Beans, IOC. But most importantly, this caught interviewers by surprise. This is a design pattern that nobody heard of. But it is a pattern. It is a recipe to solve a common problem, and it does work. What have I learned from this experience? Why am I even telling you about this? My goal here is to share some experience and to help make interview processes a bit less horrible for everyone. For the interviewers, start with them because they are the powerful side of this power dynamic. But for interviewers, it is great that you're trying to be a better interviewer. It is great that you're talking to other interviewers, trying to learn. It's great that you're reading books. But if your entire bag of tricks is this book, and again, I'm pretty sure that back in the day, everyone that interviewed me read the exact same book about design patterns. If that's your bag of tricks, if all you do is ask these clone or drone questions, you're going to get clone answers. In other words, it's great that you read the book, but don't assume that nobody else has read it. And I'm pretty sure that if my experience were a bunch of different interviewers answering the same question, as an interviewer myself, in retrospect, I can very well guarantee that from the interviewer's perspective, they would have this one question and have dozens of interviewees answering the exact same answer, which is also frustrating. On the interviewee side, well, if you are bored by this question, chances are that the interviewer is also bored. If you heard this question 3 times because you're interviewing in 3 different companies, I guarantee you that the interviewer has heard dozens of these answers, and they all sound the same, which kind of makes the interviewer's job even worse, because first of all, if you're bored and the interviewer is bored, you're just both having a bad time, and it shows. Second, as an interviewer, if I have this one question that I know how to ask, and everyone else asks it, so all of my interviewees are just rehearsing answers, I get dozens of the same answers, which are useless for me, because at the end of the day, the job of the interviewer is to interview X candidates, be able to say why out of these X has exceeded a certain bar, I think they will be good additions to our team. Out of those Ys, unfortunately, we have the budget to hire just one of them, this individual. So quite often, especially for junior interviewees, quite often just rehearsing and quote unquote memorizing answers for common questions may not get you far, may not make you stand out, excuse me. What will is surprising the interviewer, is showing them something different, something unique, something individual about you that they did not expect and did not hear anywhere else. But of course, you do need to be careful with this. If we continue this Will Wheaton Dick, I spoiled myself. If we will continue this Will Wheaton theme, I will quote the Will Wheaton law. Don't be a dick. You should not go into an interview and say, this is boring, let me tell you about something else. You do need to be respectful to the interviewer. Even the bad interviewers who did quite a bit of thrashing here. Interviewing is hard. I'm certain that when I started interviewing, I was pretty bad at it. I sincerely hope I've gotten better in it. At least that is what my mentees say. But don't be a dick about it. Even if the interview question is boring, is something you heard before, is not the smartest question, not the most challenging question that you think you deserve, don't be a dick about it. Answer it politely, answer it respectfully, but in the back of your mind, keep in the back of your mind that you may want to surprise the interviewer. It's quite often really hard to compete for the best answer, especially for common questions that are out there and people rehearse for. It's much easier to compete for the surprising answer, for something unique, something that may catch the interviewer off guard and say, okay, this isn't the dozens of things I've already heard. This is something different. Now you've got my attention. And if we tie back to the Star Trek theme from the beginning of this talk, this is indeed how the heroes, the Federation, always seem to defeat the Borg, not by overpowering them, but by being individuals, which I think is generally a good lesson for life. With that, I am done. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day for attending this conference and specifically attending my lecture. If any of this resonates with you, my contact info is up in this last slide, available by email, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I'm really not a hard person to find. By all means, feel free to reach out and continue this conversation. And I've shared here a link to my GitHub with the code snippets I've shared today in a fuller form that can also be compiled and played around with. So once again, thank you for listening, thank you for your time, and have a great conference.